The security guard's hand was already on her arm before Nora Callahan could say a single word in her defense. One moment she was standing at the nurse's station with a patient chart in her hand. The next, every eye in the Silver Creek, every eye in the Harlow Ridge Medical Center emergency wing was watching her get walked to the door like a shoplifter. The PA system was screaming a code somewhere above them. The overhead lights flickered, and Director Voss stood with his arms crossed at the end of the corridor, watching her go with the particular satisfaction of a man who had already decided the outcome before the conversation started. Nora Callahan did not cry. She did not argue. She picked up the small box of her belongings from the front desk where someone had already packed them, as if this had been planned, and she walked out through the automatic doors into the cold Montana air. 30 seconds later, the military helicopter appeared over the ridge. If you want to know what happened next, stay with me all the way to the end. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and subscribe so I can see how far this story travels. Nora had been a nurse at Harlow Ridge Medical Center in Crest Falls, Montana for 3 years. 3 years of overnight shifts, short-staffed floors, and patients who called her by her first name because she always gave them the time of day when nobody else did. She was 32, brown-haired, medium height, the kind of person who could stand in a room full of people and still somehow be invisible to the ones who mattered. That was, she'd learned, a skill as much as a condition. She rented a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Crest Falls with a drafty kitchen window she kept meaning to fix and a garden that had gone to seed before she moved in. She worked the day shift Tuesday through Saturday, picked up extra hours when the floor was short, and spent her days off mostly alone. She didn't talk much about where she'd been before Montana. When coworkers asked, she said she'd done some traveling, worked at a hospital in the Pacific Northwest. Nothing worth discussing over lunch. It was not entirely a lie. It just wasn't anything close to the full truth. The morning everything came apart had started like most mornings at Harlow Ridge, understaffed, overbooked, and quietly managed by the nurses who actually ran the place while the administration generated paperwork on the 4th floor. Nora had been assigned to the post-surgical recovery ward, which was short 2 RNs and running on her and a second-year nurse named Daphne Wick, who was fast but still learning. They'd had a complicated morning. A post-op patient in bed 7 had spiked a fever. Another in bed 12 was showing early signs of surgical site infection, and the attending physician, Dr. Forsyth, had been unreachable for the better part of 2 hours. Nora had handled it. She'd pulled the charts, flagged the lab work, adjusted the monitoring parameters within her scope, and documented everything with the kind of precision that came from years of working in environments where a missed notation could be the difference between a patient going home or not going home at all. What she hadn't done, what she'd made a judgment call not to do, was wait for Dr. Forsyth's sign-off before initiating the fever protocol on bed 7. The patient's temperature had hit 103.4. Waiting another 2 hours for a doctor who wasn't answering his pager wasn't an option she was willing to sit on. She documented the decision, the reasoning, and the outcome, as she always did. By noon, the patient in bed 7 was stable and trending down. By 1 o'clock, Director Elliot Voss was standing at the nurse's station with a printed copy of Nora's nursing notes and an expression that told her this conversation had nothing to do with bed 7. Voss was the kind of administrator hospitals produced in reliable quantities, mid-50s, silver-haired, excellent at meetings, and worse than useless in a crisis. He had arrived at Harlow Ridge 14 months ago from a health network in Nevada, and in those 14 months he had reorganized the scheduling system twice, implemented a patient satisfaction scoring protocol that the floor nurses mostly ignored, and managed to irritate nearly every department head while maintaining excellent relationships with the board. He had not, in 14 months, spent more than 12 minutes on an active patient floor. "Nurse Callahan," he said, loud enough that the 2 visitors waiting near the elevator could hear, "I need you to explain the unauthorized protocol deviation documented in these notes." Nora finished writing the chart she was on before she turned around. That small, deliberate pause. The kind of things she'd done without thinking, the kind of things she did when she needed a second to make sure she answered the way she intended and not the way her first instinct suggested, would later be described by Voss to hospital leadership as insubordinate behavior. The patient in bed 7 had a fever of 103.4, she said. Dr. Forsyth was unreachable. I followed the escalation procedure, documented the decision, and the patient responded well. You initiated a modified hydration and antibiotic adjustment without direct physician authorization. I escalated twice. I documented both attempts. The modification was within nursing scope under the escalation policy. That is not your interpretation to make. Daphne had gone very still at the other end of the station. A patient's family member who'd been waiting for someone to answer a question quietly found somewhere else to be. Mr. Voss, Nora said, keeping her voice level. The patient's temperature was still climbing. I made the safest call available given the circumstances. You made an unauthorized call, Voss said, and it won't be the first time I've reviewed your documentation for pattern deviations. That landed differently than the rest of it. Pattern deviations. As if there was a file somewhere, a collection of instances being assembled toward a conclusion that had already been decided. Nora looked at him steadily. What pattern deviations? There will be a formal review. In the meantime, I'm placing you on administrative suspension, effective immediately. He set the printed notes on the counter between them like he was laying down a card. Security will escort you out. You're not serious. I am entirely serious. You violated protocol, Nurse Callahan. We take that very seriously here. The security guard, a young guy named Marcus, who Nora had eaten lunch with twice in the cafeteria, appeared from down the hall with the particular expression of someone who had been told to do something he didn't like, but was going to do it anyway. He looked at the floor when he reached her. I'm sorry, Nora, he said quietly. She didn't make him ask twice. She went to the supply locker and retrieved her bag. Someone, she never found out who, had already put her personal items from the nurse's station into a small cardboard box. Her phone charger. A photograph of her niece she kept taped to the inside of her locker. A paperback novel she'd been slowly working through for 3 months. She signed the administrative paperwork without reading it. She'd read it later, carefully, and she already knew it wouldn't say anything that matched what had actually happened this morning. That was the thing about documentation. It only told the truth if the person doing the documenting wanted it to. Voss didn't follow her to the exit. He didn't need to. He'd already gone back to his office by the time she reached the lobby. It was 1:47 in the afternoon when Nora Callahan walked out of Harlow Ridge Medical Center and stood in the parking lot in the thin November light with a cardboard box under one arm and no particular plan for the rest of the day. She stood there for a moment, looking at the mountains beyond the hospital's east wing, the kind of view that Montana offered constantly and freely as if in compensation for everything else. Then the sky to the north changed. She heard it before she saw it, a low, rhythmic percussion that she recognized not from civilian life, but from somewhere older and more specific in her memory. The kind of sound that still, even now, even years removed from everything, made her shoulders drop half an inch and her breathing shift into a different register. Military rotors. More than one. She turned. 2 Blackhawks were coming in from the north, low and fast, already beginning their descent toward the hospital's rooftop landing pad. Behind them, further back, a 3rd aircraft, a medical transport variant she recognized by its silhouette. Not standard medevac. Something else. She stood in the parking lot and watched them come down. The rooftop pad at Harlow Ridge was rated for 2 aircraft. It was used for civilian medical transports twice, maybe 3 times a month. Military aircraft used it exactly never, in 3 years of Nora's time there. The first Blackhawk hit the pad hard and fast, the kind of landing that wasn't casual. The medical transport was still circling. The second Blackhawk was setting down beside the first before the rotors on the first had finished slowing. From where she stood in the parking lot, Nora could see the side door of the first Blackhawk slide open. Figures in tactical gear moved quickly. A stretcher came out. Then another. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from Daphne. Something is happening. Military. A lot of them. Nobody knows what's going on. Nora looked at the phone. She looked at the rooftop. She looked at the cardboard box under her arm. She got in her car. But the drive to her house took 11 minutes. She sat in the driveway for a while without going inside. The afternoon was quiet, the way Crestfall was quiet in November. deeply, conclusively quiet, the mountains holding everything still. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the block. The wind moved through the pine trees along the property line. Nora set the cardboard box on the passenger seat and looked at the photograph of her niece. Lily was 7 in that picture, missing a front tooth, grinning at something off camera. Nora had taken it during a visit to Portland 2 summers ago, the last time she'd managed to get there. She thought about calling her sister. She didn't call her sister. Inside, she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the administrative paperwork spread in front of her. She read it the way she'd known she would, carefully, noting the language, the specific framing of each accusation. Unauthorized protocol deviation. Pattern of independent action, contrary to department guidelines. Failure to follow escalation procedures. The escalation procedure she had followed was cited in the second paragraph as the procedure she had failed to follow. She read that sentence twice to make sure she'd understood it correctly. She had. She took a photograph of each page with her phone. Then she made a list on a notepad. Dates, times, incidents, and her own notes on each one. The things she remembered clearly and the things she'd need to verify from her own documentation. She'd kept personal records. She always kept personal records. That was another thing that came from somewhere older than this job, older than Montana, older than civilian nursing entirely. She was on the second page of the list when her phone rang. Unknown number, Montana area code. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. Nora Callahan? The voice was male, clipped, not unfriendly, but not wasting time either. Yes. My name is Captain Reed Barlow, United States Army Medical Corps. I'm currently at Harlow Ridge Medical Center. A pause. We have a patient who specifically requested you by name. She was quiet for a moment. I don't have any military patients, she said. You do now. Another pause, shorter. The patient's name is Sergeant Major Daniel Vreeland. He says you know him. The name went through her like a current. She knew him. She knew exactly who Daniel Vreeland was. Is he conscious? She asked. Her voice came out steady. The coffee cup in her hand was absolutely still. In and out. He's been asking for you since we lifted out of Billings. His condition is... The captain paused. We need you here, Ms. Callahan. How quickly can you be at the hospital? I'm not currently on staff at Harlow Ridge, she said. A beat. Excuse me? I was placed on administrative suspension approximately 2 hours ago. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she thought the call might have dropped. Then Captain Barlow said with a very different quality to his voice, Say that again. She didn't go back to the hospital immediately. That surprised her later. The fact that her first instinct hadn't been to drop everything and drive back. But she'd learned in the years before Montana that a first instinct could be right and still be wrong. That the right move and the smart move were sometimes separated by 60 seconds of patience. She told Captain Barlow she would call him back within the hour. He didn't like that. She did it anyway. She spent 45 minutes on the phone, one call to a nursing colleague at a different hospital who could walk her through the union side view of the suspension paperwork, one call to her own voicemail where she'd learned to leave herself date-stamped documentation records, and one call she didn't make but spent 10 minutes considering before deciding against it. The number she almost called was in a contact list she kept in a separate notes file, not her regular contacts. 8 numbers in that list. She hadn't called any of them in 3 years. She pulled the file up and looked at the list and then put the phone face down on the table. When she called Captain Barlow back, he answered before the first ring finished. I need to understand the situation on your end before I come in, she told him. What exactly is Daniel's condition? Severe thoracic trauma from an IED incident 6 days ago. He was stable in Billings, started deteriorating overnight. The local surgical team is not getting the result we need. What's the primary complication? A brief pause. Are you asking me for clinical details? I'm asking because if I walk into that hospital, I need to understand what I'm walking into. What's the primary complication? Barlow covered the phone for a moment. She could hear voices, movement, the specific ambient noise of a hospital unit. Then he came back. Persistent hypotension that isn't responding to the current protocol. The surgical wound is clean. There's something we're not seeing. Nora thought for a moment. What's his BP trend over the last 6 hours? Hold on. She heard paper. Dropped from 94/60 to 82/54. They've adjusted the drip twice. Is he on positive pressure ventilation? Transitioned to BiPAP 2 hours ago. She was already moving toward the bedroom. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Bulch. She changed out of her clothes and into a clean set. Not scrubs, just jeans and a plain dark pullover, because she wasn't going back as a Harlow Ridge employee. She was going back as someone a patient had asked for. And those were two different things with two different implications. And she wanted to be clear about which one she was before she walked through those doors. She left the cardboard box on the kitchen table. The drive back took 9 minutes. She pushed it. The hospital parking lot was different than it had been 2 hours ago. There were military vehicles, 2 black SUVs with government plates, a heavier transport van, parked along the restricted zone near the main entrance. 2 soldiers in dress uniforms stood at the main entrance, which was not standard hospital security. A third was near the elevator bank inside the lobby, visible through the glass doors. Nora parked and walked toward the entrance. One of the door soldiers stepped forward. "Nora Callahan?" he said. "Yes." "Captain Barlow's expecting you." He stepped aside. The lobby felt different with military personnel in it. The regular security desk was staffed, but the guard there, not Marcus, someone else, was watching the soldiers with the particular look of someone who didn't know what their job was anymore. 2 nurses from the 3rd floor were clustered near the elevator, talking in low voices and glancing toward the stairs. Captain Barlow was waiting near the elevator. He was mid-40s, lean, with the kind of posture that wasn't performed. It was just how the body held itself when it had been trained in a particular way for long enough. He looked at her with a rapid, assessing gaze and extended his hand. "Miss Callahan." "Captain." She shook it. "Where is he?" "ICU level 3, but before we go up..." He stopped, his jaw tightened slightly. "I need to inform you that we've run into some resistance from hospital administration regarding your access." She wasn't surprised. "Voss?" "A Director Voss, yes. He's indicated that your suspension prohibits you from entering clinical areas." "Then I need to speak with him." "We've been attempting that for the last..." "I need to speak with him," she said again, and something in the way she said it, flat, not aggressive, just absolutely without question, made Barlow look at her with a slightly different expression. "He's on 4, Barlow said. They took the stairs. Voss's office was a corner suite with a view of the mountains that had probably been a significant factor in his accepting the job. He was on the phone when they knocked, and his expression when he saw Nora in the doorway went through several distinct phases: surprise, irritation, calculation, before landing on a particular kind of composed authority that she recognized as a man deciding which version of himself to perform. He said something into the phone and set it down. "Nurse Callahan," he said, "you were informed of your suspension. Your presence here constitutes..." "Sergeant Major Daniel Vreeland is your patient," Captain Barlow said. He was standing just behind Nora's left shoulder, which she noticed without looking. "He's deteriorating. Your surgical team has not been able to stabilize him. He has specifically and formally requested Ms. Callahan's involvement in his care. The hospital's liability with respect to a suspended employee who..." "I'm not here as a hospital employee," Nora said. "I'm here because a patient asked for me. That's a patient rights issue, not an employment issue, and you know the difference." Voss stood up. He was taller than she was, and he used it the way some people used height. Not obviously, just shifted slightly, realigned the room. "You violated clinical protocol this morning," he said. "Allowing you access to any patient care area while under suspension exposes this institution to..." "To what?" Nora said. "To liability if an Army Sergeant Major dies in your ICU because you blocked the person he asked for?" The room was quiet. Barlow said, quietly and distinctly, "Director Voss, I would strongly encourage you to consider the implications of preventing military medical personnel, or personnel requested by military patients, from accessing care. That conversation will happen at a level above both of ours." Voss's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. She operates under direct observation, he said finally. Any intervention requires attending physician co-signature. She touches nothing without documented physician authorization. Fine, Nora said, and turned for the door before he could find another condition. The ICU on level 3 was controlled and tense in the specific way of units where the staff knew something was wrong and didn't know what. The attending physician on Vreeland's case was a Dr. Ansel Marsh, a cardiologist in his 50s who had the bedside manner of a man who was genuinely good at his job and not used to anyone questioning it. He looked at Nora the way most doctors looked at nurses who had been brought in over their heads, with a careful, managed patience that covered something more like offense. Nurse Callahan, he said, Captain Barlow has explained the situation. Can I see his vitals trend? I've been managing his care since— I know, she said. I'm not here to second-guess your work. I just need to understand what's happening. Marsh looked at her for a moment, then at Barlow, then at the chart in his hand. He passed it to her. She read quickly, thoroughly. She turned pages without rushing, but without pausing on anything twice. Marsh watched her with his arms crossed. One of the ICU nurses, a young woman whose name tag read Petra, watched from behind the monitoring station with open curiosity. Daniel Vreeland was in the bed at the center of the room, half screened by curtain. She could see the outline of him, large, still, connected to the kind of monitoring apparatus that turned a person into a collection of numbers and waveforms. She didn't look at him yet. She finished the chart first. When she set it down, she said, "What's his chest excursion pattern on the BiPAP?" Marsh frowned slightly. "Symmetric. We've confirmed bilateral air entry. Both sides equal. I just said, has anyone assessed for asymmetric diaphragmatic splinting?" A pause. "That's not a standard assessment for thoracic." "No," Nora said. "It's not standard. It's something you do when the standard assessments aren't giving you the picture." She set the chart down. "I need to do a physical assessment. I'll document everything. You can co-sign whatever you want." Marsh looked at her for a long-held moment. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod that didn't indicate agreement so much as a man deciding to be professional about something he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Nora moved toward the bed. She had not seen Daniel Vreeland in 4 years. He looked older than that gap should have made him, broader through the shoulders even diminished by illness, the jaw she remembered as sharp now softer in unconsciousness, the lines around his eyes deeper. He had a scar along the left side of his neck that hadn't been there 4 years ago. She didn't let herself sit with that. She did the assessment. Her hands moved with a kind of automatic competence, not performed, not for the room, just the specific economy of someone who had done this in worse conditions than this for a very long time. She checked the chest wall movement, the breath sounds, the palpation along the right lower thoracic margin that made her pause. She pressed again, carefully. "What's his documented right hemodiaphragm position on the last imaging?" she asked without looking up. The chest CT from admission, Petra was already pulling it up. Slightly elevated right hemodiaphragm, consistent with surgical trauma. How elevated? The report says, a pause. 2 centimeters above baseline. What's his current respiratory rate? 22. And it was 18 at admission, Petra checked. 18, yes. Nora straightened. She looked at Dr. Marsh. He's developing paradoxical diaphragmatic motion on the right side. The elevated pressure from the BiPAP is making it worse. You're fighting a mechanics problem with a volume solution, and it's driving his pressure down because his respiratory effort is working against itself. The room was quiet. Marsh said carefully, "That's a fairly unusual. I know it's unusual." She kept her voice even. "Which is why nobody caught it. But look at the trend. The pressure drop correlates exactly with the BiPAP parameter increase 2 hours ago. When you increase the inspiratory pressure, his BP dropped another 4 points." Marsh looked at the numbers. She watched him read them. She watched his expression change. "The management change would be, he started. Reduce the IPAP setting, switch to a targeted low-pressure support mode, and reassess diaphragmatic function in 30 minutes. She paused. With your authorization, documented. Marsh was quiet for another moment. Then he turned to Petra and gave the instructions. Nora stood back. She didn't offer anything else. She waited. Outside the ICU window, the light over the mountains had started to go orange with the late afternoon. In the hallway, she could see Barlow on his phone, speaking quietly, his back to the unit. 22 minutes later, Vreeland's blood pressure began to rise. He opened his eyes while the numbers were still climbing. His gaze was unfocused at first, moving across the ceiling tiles with the slow tracking of someone coming back from a long distance. Then it found her. She was standing at the foot of the bed. She hadn't moved. He didn't say her name. He just looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, not relief exactly, something quieter than that, something that had less to do with the present crisis and more to do with a much older accounting, settled. "Hey, Nora," he said. His voice was rough and thin. "Hey, Danny," she said. He almost smiled. "I told them you'd fix it." "I haven't fixed anything. Dr. Marsh fixed it." She tilted her head toward the monitor. "You're improving." "That's—" He coughed, winced. "That's a very careful thing to say." "I'm careful." "I know." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were sharper. "Why does Barlow look like he's been in a fight?" "Because apparently the hospital threw me out about 2 hours before you landed on the roof." Vreeland stared at her. Then he turned his head with visible effort toward the door, where Barlow was now visible through the window, still on his phone, but watching the interior of the unit with the focused expression of a man conducting several operations simultaneously. "Threw you out," Vreeland said. "Administrative suspension. Today. About 2 hours before you arrived, yes." A very long pause. His vitals beeped steadily above him, the numbers still climbing toward something that looked like stable. "Nora," he said. "I'm fine. I know you're fine." He said it with a certainty that had nothing to do with her current condition and everything to do with something older than this afternoon. "That's not what I'm thinking about." She didn't ask what he was thinking about. She already knew. In the corridor beyond the unit window, Barlow had ended his call and was standing very still, looking at something on his phone. His expression had changed. The controlled operational calm had shifted into something harder to read, something with more edges to it. He looked up and met her eyes through the glass. He held up the phone, not close enough for her to see what was on it, but with a deliberateness that meant, "You need to see this." Then a door at the end of the hallway opened, and 2 figures she didn't recognize. Not hospital staff, not the soldiers from downstairs. Walked in with the purposeful stride of people who had somewhere specific to be, and credentials that would get them there. One of them was carrying a file. The kind of file with a classification cover sheet. Nora stood at the foot of Daniel Vreeland's bed and watched them come, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not fear, not quite the opposite of fear either, but the particular hum of a situation that had just shifted into a different kind of story entirely. The kind of story she knew how to be in. The kind she'd thought she'd left behind. The 2 figures moved through the ICU corridor with the kind of authority that didn't announce itself. It just displaced everything around it. The one carrying the file was a woman, early 50s, dark blazer, no hospital badge, no military insignia. The one beside her was younger, male, with the build of someone who'd spent time in the field and the haircut to match, now wearing civilian clothes that fit slightly wrong in the shoulders. Not military, not hospital, something else. Barlow met them at the unit door before they reached it. There was a brief, low exchange. She couldn't hear it through the glass, but she read the posture. Deference from Barlow, not much but some, which told her these 2 outranked him in a way that had nothing to do with uniform. Vreeland had tracked her attention to the door. His eyes were sharper now than they'd been 20 minutes ago. The BiPAP pressure reduction doing what it was supposed to do, his color marginally better. The monitors above him telling a story that had shifted from critical to merely serious. "Who are they?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, which was true in the specific sense. In the general sense, she had a reasonable idea. "Nora." "Rest, Danny." "I'm resting. Who are they?" She looked at him. He looked back at her with the particular expression she remembered from a long time ago. Not demanding exactly, just refusing to pretend he wasn't in the room. "I think they're here about me," she said. He didn't look surprised. "How bad?" "I genuinely don't know yet." The unit door opened and Barlow came in first, followed by the woman in the dark blazer. The younger man stayed in the corridor. Dr. Marsh had drifted to the far side of the unit with the careful neutrality of a physician who understood that something was happening outside his domain and had chosen wisely to wait it out. The woman looked at Nora with the assessing efficiency of someone who had already read everything there was to read about her and was now checking it against the original. "Ms. Callahan," she said, "my name is Supervisory Agent Diane Forsett, Defense Intelligence. I'd like to speak with you privately." "This patient just came off a critical episode," Nora said. "I'd prefer to stay until the attending confirms stability." "I understand. It won't take long." From the bed, Vreeland said, "Forsett, she stays until Marsh clears me. Then you can have her." Forsett looked at him with no particular expression. "Sergeant Major, good to see you improving." "That was her," he said, "in case nobody's briefed you yet." "We're aware." Forsett turned back to Nora. "When Dr. Marsh clears the patient, I'd appreciate 5 minutes." She stepped back to the door and waited. Marsh did his assessment at the 40-minute mark. He was thorough, which Nora respected, and when he finished, he wrote in the chart for a long time before he said anything out loud. When he looked up, he looked at Nora first. "Pressure's stabilizing. Respiratory rates down to 19. He paused. "The diaphragmatic splinting. You identified that from physical assessment alone." "And the vitals trend," she said. "Most clinicians would have missed it." She didn't say anything to that. "I'm going to recommend a follow-up ultrasound to confirm," he said, "but the clinical picture is consistent with your assessment." Another pause, longer this time. "You have a specific background." "I've seen a lot of thoracic trauma," she said, which was accurate and minimal, and the most she planned to offer. Marsh looked at her for a moment, then at Vreeland, then back at his chart. He wrote one more note and signed it. "I'm comfortable with the current trajectory. The patient is stable enough for you to step away if needed." She thanked him, which she meant, and went to the door. Forsett had found a family consultation room down the hall. Small, no windows, 2 chairs and a round table, and the particular fluorescent quiet of a space designed for bad news. She was sitting when Nora came in and didn't stand, which Nora noted without inflection. "Sit down, please." Nora sat. Forsett opened the file on the table. The classification cover sheet had the corner stamp that meant it had already been downgraded for this specific conversation, which told Nora that someone above Forsett had made that decision before she walked into this room. "Before I begin," Forsett said, "I want to be clear that this conversation is voluntary. You're not compelled to answer anything." "I understand." "You went by a different name," Forsett said. Not a question. "Before Montana. Different professional identity, different civilian record." "I went through a standard transition protocol," Nora said carefully, "which was handled by the appropriate channels." "It was. I've seen the paperwork. It was handled correctly." Forsett looked at her. "What wasn't handled was this." She slid a single page across the table. Nora looked at it without picking it up. It was a personnel assessment, the kind generated at the conclusion of a service term, and it had a notation on it in red that she had never seen before. Not because it hadn't existed, but because the version of this document she'd been given at separation hadn't included this page. The notation read, "Service record classified under Title 10 provision. Operational details restricted pending ongoing mission security review. Commendation recommendations withheld pending classification status resolution." She read it twice. "Withheld," she said. "There were 7 commendation recommendations filed on your behalf at the conclusion of your service," Forsett said, "by 3 different commanding officers. All 7 were held in classification because the operations you participated in were under active security review." "For how long?" "The last review closed 14 months ago." Forsett held her gaze. "The commendations are still sitting in a file. Nobody routed them." Nora was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this now? Because Sergeant Major Vreeland's team filed an emergency inquiry when they couldn't locate you through standard channels. When military medical personnel can't find a former combat medic who should be findable, that creates questions. Forsett paused. And then we found you here, under suspension, for a protocol deviation. She said the last three words with a flatness that made them sound exactly as absurd as they were. The suspension is Director Voss's call, Nora said. We're aware of Director Voss, and Forsett closed the file. Ms. Callahan, Nora, I'm going to speak plainly for a moment. Please. Sergeant Major Vreeland's unit, the unit he's been commanding for the last 3 years, includes 8 men who were on the operation in Kordofan province. The one where you pulled 6 wounded personnel out of a collapsed forward position under direct fire and stabilized all of them in an unsecured environment with a field kit and improvised materials. She paused. 2 of those men are outside in the hallway right now. They flew here on their own time when they heard Danny was critical. Nora said nothing. The hospital threw out the person who saved their sergeant major's life, Forsett said. Twice, as it happens. Once 4 years ago in a combat zone, and once today in a parking lot. I wasn't thrown out 4 years ago. No, you separated voluntarily. Forsett's expression didn't shift. I'm not here to relitigate that. I'm here because there's a situation developing in this building that's going to require some decisions, and I think you should understand the full picture before it unfolds. What situation? Forsett was quiet for a moment. How much do you know about Director Voss's history with this hospital's Department of Defense contract? The answer was nothing. She knew nothing about any DoD contract because she'd been a floor nurse for 3 years, and that was 12 floors below the level at which those conversations happened. Forsett told her. It was not a short story, and the version Forsett told was careful, assembled from the outside with the particular quality of an investigation that had been building slowly and hadn't reached its public stage yet. The gist of it was this. Harlow Ridge Medical Center had a federal contract for military medical services in the Mountain West Corridor, a contract worth a specific dollar amount per year that Forsett named once and didn't repeat. Voss had arrived 14 months ago. The same week, Nora now realized, that the contract had come up for its biennial review. In those 14 months, there had been 3 formal complaints from nursing staff about documentation irregularities. 2 of those nurses no longer worked at the hospital. A third was currently in the middle of her own administrative review process that had been quietly opened 2 weeks ago. And there had been a series of billing discrepancies in the military contract accounts, not large individually, but consistent, and in a direction that suggested not error, but pattern. Someone flagged it internally, Forsett said. We've been building the picture, slowly, because this kind of financial manipulation is designed to survive quick scrutiny. She paused. What we didn't have was a clear precipitating incident, a moment that would create the kind of institutional disruption that brings everything to the surface at once. You think my suspension is that incident? I think Voss panicked, Forsett said. I think you found something this morning, or he believed you found something, and he moved faster than was smart because he was scared. Nora thought about the protocol deviation accusation, about pattern deviations, about the administrative paperwork that had been ready before she'd even finished reading the morning chart. The patient in bed 7, she said slowly. What about him? His surgical site infection. The treatment protocol I initiated. It involved pulling his chart for a full medication review because the fever presentation was atypical. When I pulled the medication review, I would have seen the billing codes attached to his record. She paused. I didn't look at billing codes. I was looking at clinical data. But Voss didn't know that. She considered this. No, he wouldn't have. Forsett nodded. You were doing your job. He saw a nurse pulling a chart in a way that could have, if she'd been looking, revealed exactly what he's been doing with the contract billing on post-surgical military cases. The fluorescent light hummed above them. Down the hall, a monitor alarm sounded and then stopped. Someone else's crisis, briefly noted and managed. So he suspended me before I could look more carefully, Nora said. That's our read. And now Daniel is here. And now 3 Blackhawks are on the roof, and 8 former members of Vreeland's unit are either in this building or on their way here, and my office has been on the phone with the hospital's DoD contract administrator for the last 40 minutes. Forsett leaned back slightly. Voss has had a very bad afternoon. Not bad enough yet, Nora said. Forsett looked at her with something that might, in a different kind of face, have become a smile. It didn't quite get there. No, she said. Not yet. Tut. Nora went back to the ICU. Vreeland was more awake now, his eyes tracking clearly, the monitors above him showing numbers that were cautious but defensible. The ICU nurse, Petra, was updating his chart at the station with the studious focus of someone who had decided to be extremely professional and document everything very carefully tonight, which Nora suspected had less to do with institutional policy and more to do with Petra having understood, over the last hour, that this was not a normal situation. "How are you feeling?" Nora asked him. "Like someone adjusted my breathing settings and I suddenly remembered what oxygen feels like." He shifted against the pillow. What did Forsett want? To give me some context. Good context or bad context? Complicated context. She sat in the chair beside his bed, which was the first time she'd sat down since driving back to the hospital. Her back registered the sitting with a kind of muted gratitude. "She told me about the commendations." He was quiet. 7 of them, she said. "Yeah." "You filed some of those?" "I filed 2 of them." He looked at the ceiling. "Weston filed 1. Garrity filed the other 4. Garrity doesn't file paperwork for people he doesn't think deserve it, which I think you know." "I know." "They got stuck in a classification pile because the Cordovan operation was still—" "I know." Forsett explained it. He turned his head and looked at her. In the hard light of the ICU, his face was older than she remembered it, the lines around his eyes and mouth mapping out the years in between. But his gaze was the same as it had always been, direct, without agenda, saying exactly what it meant. "You just disappeared," he said. "I needed to. I looked for you." "I know." She said it quietly. "I needed you to not find me for a while." That's a hell of a thing to say. "I know that too." She looked at the monitors rather than at him. The transition was hard, and I needed to figure out who I was without all of it before I could figure out what I wanted to do with it. She paused. Nursing made sense. I was good at it before the Army, and I was good at it after, and Montana was far enough from everything. Was it? "Not today," she said dryly. He almost laughed, which made him wince. "Don't make me laugh. My ribs still hate me." "Sorry." They were quiet for a moment. In the corridor there was movement. Barlow walking past with 2 of the civilian-dressed soldiers, a purposeful trajectory toward the elevators. Going to the 4th floor, Nora guessed. Going to wherever Voss was. "What's happening with Voss?" Vreeland asked. "Forsett's building a case. Has been for a while. My suspension today may have accelerated the timeline." "How?" She explained it briefly. The billing irregularities, the DoD contract, the pattern of documentation manipulation, the way Voss had moved against her too quickly because he'd misread what she was looking at that morning. Vreeland listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd always respected about him. He gathered information before he responded to it, didn't reorganize facts to fit a conclusion he'd already reached. When she finished, he said, "He threw you out because he thought you'd seen something you hadn't seen." That's Forsett's read. And now his panic has put him directly in the path of a federal investigation that was already coming for him anyway. Essentially. That is extremely stupid behavior for someone who apparently thought he was being careful. "Fear makes people stupid," Nora said. "Smart people especially. They get afraid and they substitute speed for judgment." Vreeland considered this. "What do you need right now?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what do you need? Not what does the investigation need, not what does Forsett need. You." It was a direct question, the kind he'd always asked, and she took it seriously the way she always had. "I need my nursing license to not be in jeopardy," she said. "The suspension documentation is framed in a way that could trigger a board review if it isn't countered. And I need whatever Voss has in that so-called pattern deviations file to be examined by someone who isn't his department." That's manageable. It shouldn't require a sergeant major in an ICU bed and a defense intelligence agent to manage it. No, he agreed. It shouldn't. But here we are. She stood up. Her back protested again, less politely this time. Rest. Your diaphragm needs to stop fighting your ventilator, and it can only do that if you're not talking. The diaphragm and I have always had a complicated relationship. Rest, Danny. The fourth floor had a different atmosphere than it had 3 hours ago. She felt it before she saw it. The particular quality of institutional air when something significant is in the process of changing. 2 of Harlow Ridge's department heads were clustered near the administrative suite, speaking quietly with the body language of people receiving news rather than giving it. The receptionist outside Voss's office was at her desk, but not looking at her screen. Barlow was standing in the hallway outside the administrative suite, with his arms crossed, and an expression that had been arranged into neutrality so carefully it was obvious something underneath it was not neutral at all. When he saw Nora, he straightened. What's happening? She asked. Forset's been on the phone with the hospital's board liaison for the past 30 minutes, he said. Voss was asked to produce the documentation behind your suspension and the personnel files of the 2 previous nurses who were terminated. And? He produced the suspension documentation. He told them the other files were in an administrative archive and would take time to retrieve. How much time? He said 48 hours. Nora looked at him steadily. That's not a retrieval time frame, that's a preparation time frame. That is also Forset's assessment. Barlow uncrossed his arms. She's requested a preservation order on all administrative files from the board liaison. If the board doesn't issue it in the next hour, she has a secondary pathway through the contract oversight office. What does Voss know about that? At this point, Barlow glanced toward the closed office door. Enough to be very unhappy. As if in answer, the door opened. Voss came out of his office with the expression of a man who had decided to be offensive rather than defensive. Jaw set, stride slightly too fast, the particular energy of someone who had just talked himself into a position in a private room and was now going to hold it in public. He saw Nora and stopped. The halt was only a second, maybe less, but it was there. Nurse Callahan, he said, you've been cleared for patient access under the conditions I specified. I expect those conditions to be followed exactly. They're being followed, she said. If I have any further documentation of scope violations, Mr. Voss, she kept her voice even, the same flat delivery she'd used this morning that he'd called insubordinate. Your patient is stable. My assessment was correct, and it's documented by the attending physician. If you want to discuss the conditions of my access, that conversation can include Captain Barlow and Supervisory Agent Forset. She said the last name clearly and watched his face. Something happened there. A very small shift, like a structural calculation running and not coming out clean. Agent Forset is conducting a routine review, he said, and the word routine came out with the careful emphasis of a man who needed the word to be true. Of course, Nora said, and left it there. She walked back toward the stairs. Behind her, she heard Voss say something to Barlow in a low voice, and Barlow's reply. Short, precise. The tone of someone delivering a fact they've already decided to deliver. Sir, I would strongly recommend you speak with your legal counsel before the end of business today. The stairwell door closed behind her. Daphne found her on the second-floor landing. The younger nurse was still in her scrubs, her shift technically over by now, but clearly not left, and she had the look of someone who had been processing a complicated afternoon in real time and hadn't finished. I heard what happened, Daphne said, this morning, and all of it. It's okay, Daphne. It's not. She said it with the particular certainty of someone very young who had decided what they thought and wasn't going to unsay it. The patient in bed 7 is doing well, by the way. Temp's been normal for 2 hours. Good. And the billing code thing, the reason Voss actually came after you. She stopped. I looked at bed 7's chart after you left, because I wanted to understand what happened. And the billing codes on his post-surgical record looked wrong to me, so I made a copy. Nora looked at her. Daphne reached into the pocket of her scrubs and produced a folded piece of paper. I don't know if this is what I think it is, Daphne said, but I know it doesn't look right. And I know you were right this morning and they treated you like you weren't, and I wasn't going to just... She stopped again. I'm probably going to get in trouble for this. You might, Nora said honestly, but you did the right thing. She took the paper. She unfolded it enough to see the billing code column, the charges listed against a military insurance identifier, the discrepancy between what was documented clinically and what had been billed. It was exactly what Forsett had described, and Daphne had found it on her own in 40 minutes with no institutional backing and no one telling her where to look. Come with me, Nora said. I need to introduce you to someone. They went up, not down, up toward the third floor where Forsett had commandeered the consultation room that still smelled like old coffee and difficult conversations. Nora knocked. Forsett opened the door, looked at Daphne, looked at the paper in Nora's hand. This is Daphne Wick, Nora said. She's a second-year nurse on the post-surgical floor. She found something you need to see. Forsett stepped back from the door. Come in, Ms. Wick. Daphne looked at Nora. It's fine, Nora said. She's one of the good ones. They went in. The next 2 hours were the slow kind of tense, the kind where the obvious crisis has passed, but something larger is clearly building, and everyone in the building who was paying attention could feel it. The way you could feel the pressure change before a storm, even if the sky was still clear. Nora checked on Vreeland twice. His numbers were holding. Marsh had ordered the follow-up ultrasound, which confirmed the diaphragmatic motion issue, and also confirmed Nora's assessment so precisely that the imaging tech had looked at the result and then looked at the chart annotation and then looked at the result again. Marsh himself had come back to the unit, reviewed the imaging, and written a note in the chart that was longer and more detailed than the ones he'd written before Nora arrived, the kind of note that documented not just the intervention, but the diagnostic reasoning behind it, the kind of note, she recognized, that a careful clinician wrote when they wanted the record to be clear. She was in the corridor outside the ICU when Barlow found her. His expression had changed again. The controlled, operational calm had a different quality to it now, something that was less management and more preparation. He'd been on the phone, she could tell. There was that particular slightly unfocused quality to his gaze of someone who has just received information and is still integrating it. There's a development, he said. What kind? The hospital's board liaison contacted the Contract Oversight Office about the preservation order. Standard procedure, but it triggered an automatic review protocol because the contract has federal flag status. He paused. Which means the Oversight Office notified DoD compliance. How fast? Fast. They're sending a compliance team. When? They were already in Billings for a separate review. They're driving here. He looked at her steadily. They'll be here in approximately... His phone rang. He looked at it, answered it with a 2-word response, listened, and then held it slightly away from his ear. From where she stood, she could hear the voice on the other end. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the quality of them. Urgent and not calm. Barlow ended the call and looked at her with an expression that was doing a great deal of work. That was Petra, he said, from the ICU. Her stomach tightened. Vreeland? Not Vreeland. He put his phone in his pocket. One of his men, Corporal Taft. He was in the waiting area on 3. He apparently got into a confrontation with Director Voss in the hallway outside the administrative suite. He paused. Voss made a comment about Vreeland's condition and about you specifically, about the clinical decisions made today. What kind of comment? Barlow's expression was very carefully controlled. The kind that suggests Voss has been talking to someone about challenging the documentation of your intervention, suggesting the diaphragmatic diagnosis was fabricated retroactively to justify unauthorized action. The corridor was quiet around them. Down the hall, a nurse was pushing a medication cart, its wheels making their small, specific sound against the linoleum. Nora thought about Marsh's chart note, about the imaging report, about Daphne's paper, now presumably in Forsett's hands. She thought about the particular, specific brand of desperation it took for a man to try to reframe a documented medical intervention while a federal agent was in the building reviewing his financial records. "Where is Voss now?" she asked. "That's the other thing." Barlow looked at her. He's not in his office. He's not answering his phone. And the administrative assistant on 4 says he left the building 20 minutes ago. The elevator at the end of the hall dinged. The doors opened. 3 people came out. 2 of them Nora had never seen before. A man and a woman in suits with the specific purposeful bearing of federal compliance personnel arriving with an agenda. The third was a hospital board member named Sylvia Grant, whom Nora had seen exactly once at an all-staff meeting 2 years ago, and who was now moving through the corridor with the expression of someone who had received a phone call they had not enjoyed and had driven 40 minutes in the dark to deal with the source of it. Sylvia Grant looked around the corridor, and when her eyes found Nora, she stopped. "You're Callahan," she said. Not a question. "Yes. I've been on the phone with 3 different federal offices in the last hour." She looked at Nora with the careful, assessing gaze of a woman who had run a hospital board for 11 years and understood, in a way that Voss never had, the difference between a problem you managed and a problem you'd let become something else entirely. "I've been told that your clinical assessment today may have saved a military patient's life and that your suspension documentation contains material irregularities." "That's accurate, Case," Nora said. "I've also been told that the director who suspended you has just left the building." "I heard the same thing." Grant looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at Barlow, at the compliance officers behind her, at the corridor with its evening shift quiet and its thin institutional light. "I need to understand exactly what happened in this building today," she said. "From the beginning." "From which beginning?" Nora asked. Grant's mouth tightened slightly. "All of them," she said. "And somewhere below them, on the ground floor, in the parking lot, in the direction of the highway that cut north through the dark Montana mountains, a car alarm went off. Brief, sharp, and then silent. But the hospital security desk radio crackled 2 minutes later with a report that made the overnight guard sit up straight and reach immediately for his phone. A vehicle matching the description of Director Voss's car had been found idling at the edge of the staff parking lot. Empty. The security desk radio was still crackling when Nora moved. She didn't run. Running in a hospital corridor at shift change drew attention in the wrong direction, slowed things down, made people stop and ask questions when questions were the last thing anyone needed right now. She walked fast. The specific long stride of someone with a destination and a timeline, toward the stairwell with Barlow 2 steps behind her. "He could have gone on foot," she said. "Parking lot's fenced on 3 sides," Barlow said. "The only pedestrian exit without a key card is the north gate. That comes out on the service road." Does Voss have a key card for anything other than the administrative suite?" "Standard building access, same as any senior staff." She pushed through the stairwell door. "Then he can get to the basement level. The tunnel." Barlow was quiet for half a second. "There's a tunnel?" "Maintenance access. Runs under the north wing to the auxiliary building. Most admin staff don't know it exists." She was already at the basement landing. "Facilities staff use it in winter. I've done supply runs through it twice when the elevators were out." The basement was colder than the floors above. The particular institutional cold of a space that got climate controlled as an afterthought, concrete block walls and overhead pipes, and the specific smell of cleaning solution and old machinery. The lights were motion activated and came on in segments ahead of them, which meant if Voss had come through here recently, the lights would still be active. They were. 3 sections lit, the 4th just clicking on as they moved. "He's ahead of us," she said. "By how far?" "Maybe 4 minutes." Barlow already had his radio out. She heard him speaking into it in clipped sentences. Location, direction, requesting personnel at the auxiliary building exterior, while they moved through the tunnel's straight concrete length, their footsteps making flat echoes off the walls. What she was thinking, and not saying yet because she needed to be wrong, was why Voss had left his car running. You didn't leave your car running if you were fleeing. You left your car running if you were coming back, or if someone else was coming to it, or if the car was not the point, but the appearance of having left in the car was. She was still working through that when the tunnel opened into the auxiliary building's maintenance level, and the lights ahead of them were already on. Not motion-triggered, but manually switched, every single one of them. Barlow saw it too. He put a hand out. They stopped. The maintenance level was a long room, shelving units down both sides, a central aisle, equipment lockers at the far end. And at the far end, crouched beside one of the lockers with his phone in his hand and the particular body language of a man who had been in the middle of something and had just heard people enter behind him, was Elliot Voss. He straightened slowly. In his other hand, not a weapon, nothing like that, was a portable hard drive. Small, black, the kind you bought at an electronics store for $100. The kind you used when you needed to move data quickly and quietly and didn't want to use the network. The three of them stood in the long maintenance room and looked at each other. "Mr. Voss," Barlow said. "This is a restricted area," Voss said, and the absurdity of the statement seemed to land on him even as he said it, because something in his face shifted, the authority performance briefly failing, the man underneath it briefly visible. "Put the drive down," Barlow said. "I have every right to, put it down." Voss looked at Nora, not at Barlow, at her. She recognized the look. She'd seen it before, in different contexts, on different faces. The look of someone who has run out of road and is making a rapid, panicked calculation about whether there's a version of this moment they can still control. "You think this is justice," he said. "You think what's happening tonight is—" "I'm not thinking about justice," she said. "I'm thinking about the fact that you're holding evidence in a federal investigation in a maintenance basement. This is my property. If it's hospital property, it's covered by the preservation order. If it's your personal property, taking it from a location connected to a federal investigation is a different problem." She kept her voice flat. "Either way, you should put it down." He looked at the drive. He looked at her. He looked at Barlow with his radio and the knowledge of personnel already moving to the exterior doors. His hand opened. The drive hit the concrete floor with a sharp crack and skidded 2 feet down the aisle. Barlow handled the rest of it. That was the right word for it. Handled. With the efficient procedural competence of someone who had done field work and knew how to secure a situation without escalating it further than it needed to go. He made 2 calls, one to Forsett and one to the compliance officers on the 4th floor, and within 12 minutes there were 4 additional people in the maintenance level, and Voss was sitting on a folding chair near the lockers with the specific stillness of a man who has made the calculation that there is nothing left to do. Nora left before the documentation process started. She wasn't needed for that part. She went back through the tunnel and up the stairs and to the ICU on 3, because that was where she was needed, and because there was a limit, she had learned over a long time, to how much she could hold in her attention at once without the important things suffering. Vreeland was awake when she came in. Actually awake, not the fragile, effortful consciousness of earlier, but something more like himself, sitting up a few degrees with the BiPAP removed and a standard nasal cannula in its place, which meant Marsh had done another assessment while she was in the basement and had liked what he found. "You look like you've been in a basement," Vreeland said. "I have been in a basement." Voss? Sitting on a folding chair waiting for the federal compliance team to finish setting up their documentation process. He was quiet for a moment. "Hard drive?" "Small one. He was in the middle of copying files when we found him." "Stupid," Vreeland said. Not with satisfaction, just as an observation. "Scared people do stupid things," she said, for the 2nd time today, and sat down in the chair beside his bed. Her legs had decided they were done making the decision about whether she was tired or not. She was tired. "Your breathing is better," she said. Marsh came by. "He said the ultrasound confirmed your assessment." He paused. He said it in the careful way that doctors say things when they're acknowledging they missed something, but want to make sure the acknowledgement sounds like a compliment. "He's a good physician," she said. "He didn't dismiss it when it mattered." "No." Vreeland looked at her. "How are you actually doing?" "I'm fine." "Nora." "I'm tired, and I've been awake since 5 this morning, and my suspension paperwork is sitting on my kitchen table, and I have no idea what tomorrow looks like professionally." She looked at the monitors. His sats were at 94, which was acceptable given the transition off BiPAP. His heart rate was steady in the low 60s. "But I'm fine. You're improving. The people who need to know what happened today know it. The rest is process." "The rest is never just process." "No," she admitted, "but it's process for tonight." He accepted that. He always had known when to let a thing land and when to push it further, which was one of the reasons she'd trusted him, once, in ways that she hadn't trusted many people. They were quiet for a while. The ICU had settled into its night rhythm, the lower staffing, the dimmer lights, the monitors keeping their steady vigil. Petra had been replaced by the night nurse, a quiet man named Osei, who moved through the unit with the unhurried competence of someone who had worked nights for years and had made peace with the specific nature of that work. Forsett appeared at the unit window around 9:30. She didn't come in. She held up her phone, showing Nora a document on the screen. From the distance, she could read the header. Emergency Preservation and Evidence Seizure Order, Harlow Ridge Medical Center. Below it, a second line. Suspension of Administrative Authority. Director E. Voss, pending investigation. Forsett lowered the phone. She looked at Nora through the glass for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked back toward the elevator. The call came at 11:17. Nora was in the family waiting area on 3, not sleeping but not entirely awake either. The specific suspended state of someone running on institutional coffee and compressed adrenaline. When her phone lit up with the unknown Montana number again, she answered it. Ms. Callahan? Not Forsett this time. A different voice. Older, male, the kind of voice that had given briefings in rooms where briefings mattered. My name is General Harlan Pruitt, Army Medical Command. I've been briefed on today's situation at Harlow Ridge. She sat up. I understand you stabilized Sergeant Major Vreeland after the local surgical team was unable to identify the primary complication. In consultation with the attending physician, she said, Captain Barlow's report indicates the diagnostic assessment was yours. She didn't argue with that. Yes, sir. I've also been briefed on your suspension and the circumstances behind it. A pause. And on your service record, the complete version. The waiting room was empty except for her. Down the hall, Osei was doing his rounds. The night shift ward was doing the thing night shifts did, drawing inward, quieting, the building settling into a different key. I understand there were commendations that weren't routed, she said carefully. 7, Pruitt said. I've seen them. All 7. Another pause, longer. What I want you to know tonight is that the record is being corrected. The classification review that held those commendations has been finalized, and the commendations will be processed. That should have happened 14 months ago, and it didn't, and I'm sorry for that. She didn't have an immediate response to that. She hadn't expected a general to apologize to her at 11:17 at night in a Montana hospital waiting room. Thank you, she said, which was inadequate, and also the only thing that fit. Your nursing license is not in jeopardy, Pruitt continued. The suspension documentation has been flagged for immediate review by the State Board's federal liaison. Given the circumstances and the pending investigation, the board will not initiate any action. You'll receive formal written confirmation tomorrow. She exhaled slowly. There are going to be conversations in the coming days about what comes next, Pruitt said. Not tonight. Tonight you should get some rest. A pause. Barlow tells me you haven't left the hospital since they brought you back in. The patient is stable and in good hands. Go home, Ms. Callahan. Get some sleep. He paused. That's not an order. That's a suggestion from someone who spent 30 years not taking enough of his own advice. Despite everything, she almost smiled. Thank you, General. Thank you, he said. You know why? The call ended. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and the quiet of the third floor around her and the long, specific wait of a day that had started at 5 in the morning with a patient's fever and had arrived here, at this waiting room chair, at this particular moment, through a route she could not have predicted this morning even if she'd tried. She went back to the ICU to tell Vreeland she was leaving. He was asleep, actually asleep, his breathing even, his monitors steady and unthreatening. She stood at the window and watched the numbers for a minute. Then she got her bag from the nurse's station where Osei had been keeping it and walked to the elevator. She pressed the lobby button. The elevator descended. At the second floor, it stopped. The doors opened. Sylvia Grant was standing there with her coat on and the expression of someone who had been in the building for 6 hours doing damage control and had arrived at the particular clarity that sometimes came at the end of a very long, very bad day. Grant looked at her. Nora looked at Grant. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Grant stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. "The board met by phone at 10 o'clock, Grant said, looking at the elevator doors. "Emergency session. We've accepted Voss's administrative suspension pending the federal investigation. We've appointed the deputy operations director as interim while we assess." She paused. "We've also reviewed the suspension documentation on your file." "And?" Grant was quiet for 3 full seconds. "The documentation was falsified," she said. "The protocol deviation cited in your suspension papers references a policy revision that hadn't been implemented on your floor yet. Voss cited a version of the escalation procedure that wasn't active on your unit as of this morning." She looked at Nora directly. "You followed the correct protocol, the one that was actually in place, and he suspended you citing a policy that, on your floor, didn't exist yet." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Neither of them moved immediately. "The board owes you an apology," Grant said, "a formal one in writing with full reinstatement and record correction." She paused. "That will come. I'll make sure of it." "Thank you," Nora said. "Don't thank me. We should have caught this before it reached today." Grant stepped out of the elevator. "Go home, Ms. Callahan." Nora walked through the lobby, past the security desk where the overnight guard was watching the parking lot monitors, past the spot where her cardboard box had been sitting that afternoon, through the automatic doors and into the Montana night. The cold hit her cleanly. Clear sky, stars hard and bright above the mountains, the temperature somewhere in the low 20s and dropping. Her breath made small clouds. She found her car, got in, and sat for a moment before starting it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Daphne. "Forset's team found 2 more falsified files tonight. The nurses Voss terminated, both of them. Their documentation looks exactly like yours." She stared at the message. Then another buzz. Same number. "Also, Forset wants to know if you'd be willing to give a formal statement tomorrow morning. I think there's more to this than we know." She put the phone in her pocket. She started the car. She was halfway out of the parking lot when her headlights swept across a figure standing near the main entrance. Not hospital staff, not military, but a man in a dark coat with a press badge clipped to his lapel, talking on his phone with the particular alertness of someone who had caught a thread and was already pulling it. A reporter. Which meant someone had talked, which meant by morning this would be somewhere other than the walls of Harlow Ridge Medical Center. She turned out of the lot onto the dark highway and drove north through the cold. The mountains were black shapes against a blacker sky. The road was empty. The heater was working its way toward warm. She was 10 minutes from her house when Barlow called. "I need to tell you something," he said without preamble, "before you see it somewhere else." "What?" "The hard drive," he said. "Forset's team has been going through it. The billing irregularities were there, everything we expected." He paused. "But there's a second set of files, not billing, personnel." "What kind of personnel files?" "Medical records," he said. "From military patients, flagged for specific diagnoses. Nora..." He stopped. He was selling patient data, military patient data, to a third party, and we found 3 cases where treatment decisions on military patients at this hospital appear to have been influenced by that third party's recommendations. The car was very quiet around her. The road was straight and dark and empty. "Influenced how?" she asked. "Delayed," Barlow said. "In 2 cases, significantly delayed. In one case..." He stopped again. "One case we're treating as a potential wrongful death inquiry." She kept her hand steady on the wheel. "The patient," she said slowly, "the one who died. Do you have a name?" A pause on Barlow's end. Long enough that she knew what was coming before he said it. Not the specific content, but the weight of it, the particular gravity of information that changes the shape of everything that came before it. "His name was Corporal Marcus Webb," Barlow said. "He was treated at this hospital 8 months ago. He was 24 years old." She pulled the car to the shoulder without thinking about it. The gravel crunched under the tires. She stopped. "Nora," Barlow said. "Are you still there?" She was staring at the dark road ahead of her and thinking about a name. Not Corporal Webb, not yet, but a different name. The name of the security guard who had walked her to the door this morning with his eyes on the floor and the specific look of someone doing something he didn't want to do. Marcus, who had eaten lunch with her twice in the cafeteria. What did you say his full name was? She said. Webb. Marcus Webb. What unit? The sound of paper. 3rd Battalion, 11th Infantry, Mountain West Posting, Billings-based. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Barlow, she said. The security guard who escorted me out of the hospital this morning. His first name is Marcus. Do you know his last name? A very long pause. I'll find out, Barlow said, and she could hear the change in his voice, the shift into the particular register of someone who has just understood that a story they thought they knew has a room in it they hadn't opened yet. She sat on the shoulder of the highway for another minute after Barlow ended the call. The heater had finally reached warm. Outside, the wind moved through the pines along the road's edge in long, slow passes, and the mountains were still their dark, indifferent shapes against the sky, and none of that had changed. Everything else had. She thought about Marcus Webb, the security guard. Young, maybe 26, the easy laugh he had in the cafeteria, the way he'd said, "I'm sorry," Nora that morning before walking her to the door. She thought about what it meant if he was related to Corporal Marcus Webb, 24 years old, treated here 8 months ago, now the subject of a wrongful death inquiry. She thought about the specific cruelty of that. A young man who had worked in this building while his brother or cousin or whoever Corporal Webb was to him had died in this building, possibly because someone in this building had let it happen for money. She pulled back onto the highway and drove home. She didn't sleep much. 4 hours, maybe less. The kind of sleep that runs in shallow pools between stretches of lying still with her eyes open and the ceiling doing nothing useful. At 4:30, she gave up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with her phone and the administrative paperwork still spread in front of her from yesterday afternoon, which was also today, technically, though it felt like a different calendar entirely. Barlow texted at 6:12. Security guard's full name is Marcus Tanner Webb. His brother was Corporal Patrick Webb, 3rd Battalion, 11th Infantry. Patrick Webb died at Harlow Ridge 8 months ago. Officially listed as complications from surgical repair of a combat injury, Marcus Webb has been working at the hospital for 7 months. She read it twice. 7 months. He'd taken a job at the hospital where his brother died 7 months ago. She didn't know what that meant exactly, whether it was grief or suspicion or something in between, but it was the kind of thing that didn't happen without a reason, and the reason mattered. She texted back, "Has anyone spoken to him?" The response came 4 minutes later. He left his shift at midnight and hasn't been reachable since. Forsett wants to find him before he does something complicated. She put the phone down and looked at the kitchen window. The sky outside was just beginning to lighten at the edges, the particular gray-blue of a Montana dawn in November. The pine trees along her property line were dark shapes becoming clearer. Marcus Webb had been in that building for 7 months. He'd had access to patient records, to the administrative floors, to the maintenance areas. He'd walked her to the door yesterday morning with his eyes down. She picked up her phone again. She called Barlow. He answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't slept either. "He knows," she said. Marcus Webb, he knows what happened to his brother. That's why he took the job. A pause. That's my read too. Has Forsett found him? Not yet. His apartment is empty. His car's still in the hospital lot. He's still in the building, she said. The overnight security sweep. He worked security for 7 months. He knows where the sweep goes and when. If he wanted to stay in that building undetected, he could. Another pause, longer. What do you think he's planning to do? She looked at the administrative paperwork on her table, at the suspension documentation with its fabricated policy citation, at the billing irregularities Daphne had found, at the shape of what Voss had built in 14 months, careful, layered, designed to survive casual examination, and the shape of what Marcus Webb had probably spent 7 months quietly assembling on his own. I think he found the same evidence Forsett found, she said, possibly more. And I think he's been waiting for a moment when Voss was already exposed before he used it. Why? Because evidence that surfaces from an anonymous source is scrutinized. Evidence that surfaces in the context of an existing federal investigation is evidence. Barlow was quiet. Then, "You're saying he's been waiting to hand it over." "I'm saying he's been waiting to hand it over in a way that couldn't be buried." She paused. "He watched what happened to me yesterday. He was there when I was walked out. And then a federal agent arrived and Voss's hard drive turned up and suddenly everything changed in the space of one afternoon. She thought for a moment. He knows it's time, but he doesn't know how to do the handoff without implicating himself for whatever access methods he used to build his own file. He accessed restricted records. 7 months of them, probably, without authorization. She stood up and took her coffee cup to the sink. He's scared, and he's in a building he knows better than almost anyone. I'll tell Forsett. Tell her not to send uniformed personnel. Not yet. If he sees a hard approach coming, he may destroy what he has to protect himself. She rinsed her cup. Let me go in first. Nora, I'll call you when I have him. She was at the hospital by 7:40. The parking lot had the specific population of early morning. The first shift arriving, the overnight shift leaving, a news van from a billing station parked at a careful distance from the main entrance that told her Barlow's reporter with a press badge from last night hadn't been alone. There were 2 of them now, and they had a camera. She went in through the auxiliary building entrance, the same one she'd used last night, and took the maintenance tunnel back to the main building's basement. The tunnel lights were off, motion activated, not manually switched, which meant nobody had been through here in the last hour. She went up the service stairs to the 2nd floor and stood in the stairwell for a moment, thinking about where Marcus Webb would go in this building if he wanted to be somewhere with access to administrative records, physical safety from a quick security sweep, and a reason to be there if someone found him by accident. There was one place. The clinical documentation room on 2 was technically a record storage area, but it had a workstation, full access to the hospital's patient record system, and a lock that responded to a facilities badge. Marcus Webb's security badge had facilities access. She'd seen him use it once, months ago, when a patient's family had gotten turned around near the records corridor and he'd opened a door to redirect them. She went to the clinical documentation room. The door was unlocked. The light was on, the dim secondary light, not the overheads. The workstation screen was dark, but the power light was on. Marcus Webb was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall beneath the window, his security jacket folded on the floor beside him, his phone face down in his lap. He was 26, maybe 27, with the particular hollowed-out quality of someone who had not been sleeping properly for months. He looked up when she came in. He didn't look surprised to see her. I figured they'd send you, he said. Nobody sent me. She closed the door behind her and stayed near it. I came because I thought I understood why you were still here, and I wanted to make sure I was right before anyone else came looking. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the wall across from him. Did they find the drive? Last night, in the maintenance basement. He made a short, humorless sound. 7 months, and he panics and grabs the one drive that... He stopped. Did they get everything on it? Forsett's team has been working through it since last night. Billing irregularities, patient data sales, potential influence on treatment decisions. She paused. They found your brother's case. The room went very still. Marcus Webb closed his eyes. 1 breath, 2. When he opened them, they were wet at the edges, and he was working to keep his jaw steady. Patrick's file was flagged, he said. I found it 4 months ago, in the restricted administrative archive. The flag meant his case had been reviewed by an external medical consultant, someone outside the hospital. He paused. The consultant recommended delaying the secondary surgical repair by 72 hours, pending a different insurance coding review. She knew what that meant. She didn't say it, she let him. He died from a pulmonary embolism 40 hours into that delay, Marcus said. The surgical repair would have addressed the vascular damage that caused it. His voice was flat and precise, the way voices got when someone had rehearsed saying a thing so many times the emotion had been worn smooth. He was 24. He'd been in the Army for 4 years. He came home from his second deployment with a repaired femoral injury, and they killed him in a hospital bed because someone somewhere was making money on billing codes. Nora stood with her back against the door and let the words be in the room. What did you find? She asked. In 7 months? He reached beside him and picked up a USB drive. Not the same as Voss's, smaller, an older model. He held it up. 3 other cases with the same external consultant flag. Patrick's case. A second death that was classified as natural causes. 2 more that I think had delayed treatment, but the patient survived. The consultant's identity, Voss was careful, it's all coded, but the payment structure traces to a medical consulting LLC registered in Delaware. I have the registration documents. He turned the drive over in his fingers. And I have Voss's personal email archive, the last 14 months. She looked at the drive. How did you get his email archive? She said carefully. I had access to the server room for security checks. I installed a passive logging application. He met her eyes. I know what that is legally. I know it's a problem. It's a significant problem. I know. He looked at the drive again. But the emails are the connective tissue. Without them, the billing files are patterns. With them, they're a case. He paused. I've been trying to figure out for 4 months how to hand this over without it getting buried and without going to prison for obtaining it. And then yesterday happened. And then yesterday happened. He looked at her. You got walked out of here for catching something you weren't even looking for, and 6 hours later there was a federal agent in the building and Voss's own drive was in evidence. He turned the USB in his hand one more time. The window was now or never. She thought about Forsett, about what Forsett would do with an illegally obtained email archive versus what would happen if that archive was never surfaced and the case was built without it. Possible, probably, but slower, with more gaps. She thought about Patrick Webb, 24, dying in a hospital bed 40 hours into a delay that shouldn't have happened. She thought about the 2 other patients whose cases Marcus had found, and the ones he might not have found. Forsett is not law enforcement, she said. She's defense intelligence. The legal pathways for evidence she uses in an administrative investigation are different from what a federal prosecutor needs. She paused. But if you hand that drive to her directly, and she finds anything that can be used, she will have to disclose how she obtained it and from whom, and that becomes your problem formally and officially. He looked at her. So, what do you suggest? I suggest you speak with an attorney before you hand anything to anyone. Today, not tomorrow. An attorney who handles federal whistleblower cases. She met his gaze. What you did was illegal. But why you did it, and what you found, and the context of a federal investigation already underway, those things matter. A lot. The right attorney can make a difference between this destroying you and this protecting you. He was quiet for a long moment. Forsett's going to want to know what I have, he said. Yes. Can I tell her I have something without telling her what it is yet? You can tell her you have information relevant to the investigation and that you're seeking legal counsel before making any disclosures. That's your right. She'll be frustrated. She'll wait. He stood up. Slowly, the way someone moved who had been sitting on a hard floor for hours. He put the drive in his pocket. Patrick would have thought this was all completely insane, he said. What would he have thought about you taking a security job at the hospital where he died? Marcus looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, not quite the opposite. He would have called me a stubborn idiot and then helped me figure out how to do it better. Sounds like someone who knew you well, she said. Yeah, Marcus said quietly. He did. She took him to Forsett at 8:15. The conversation was exactly as difficult as she'd predicted. Forsett had the contained frustration of an investigator who had just learned there was potentially decisive evidence in the room that she couldn't touch yet, and she managed it with the professional discipline of someone who had been in exactly this situation before and knew that pushing too hard made attorneys more protective, not less. By 9 o'clock, Forsett had connected Marcus with a federal whistleblower attorney in Billings who agreed to drive to Crestfall by noon. Marcus sat in the consultation room on 3. The same one where Forsett had briefed Nora the night before, and waited with the particular patience of someone who had been waiting for months and could manage another few hours. By 10 o'clock, the hospital had a different texture. She felt it moving through the building the way weather moved. Not announced, just present. The air changed. The news van in the parking lot had become 3 news vans. The Billings Morning News had run a segment, she heard from Daphne, about a federal investigation at a Montana hospital involving military patient data. No names yet, just the shape of it. The board had issued a formal statement suspending Voss pending the investigation. The statement was careful and institutional in the way that formal statements were, but it was public and it was unambiguous. And by mid-morning, it had been shared across every healthcare industry notification channel that Nora knew of and several she didn't. Daphne found her near the nurse's station on 2 at 10:30 with a coffee she'd clearly been carrying around waiting to deliver. "Here," she said. Nora took it. "Thank you. Also," Daphne hesitated, "the nursing board liaison called the hospital this morning. The state board received the federal flag on your suspension last night. They're formally closing the inquiry. No action." She said it with the slightly stunned quality of someone reporting something they were relieved about but hadn't fully processed. "The suspension is void. You're reinstated as of today." Nora drank the coffee. It was slightly overbrewed and exactly what she needed. "Daphne," she said, "the billing documentation you found yesterday. Have you given your formal statement to Forset's team yet?" "At 8 this morning." "Good. They said I'm a witness in a federal investigation." Daphne said this with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: anxiety and something that was nevertheless not regret. "That's going to be an interesting thing to explain to my mother. Tell her you did the right thing when it would have been easier not to. She's going to want more detail than that." "Most people do," Nora said. "Give her the version you're comfortable with and let the rest come out when it comes out." Voss was formally arrested at 11:47. She wasn't in the building when it happened. She'd gone to the parking lot to get something from her car and was walking back through the main entrance when she saw the 2 federal compliance officers she'd met in the elevator the night before coming through the lobby doors with Elliot Voss between them. He was in the same clothes he'd been wearing last night, slightly disheveled, and he was not in handcuffs. This was a federal administrative detention, not a criminal arrest, technically, at least at this stage, but the effect was the same. He saw her. She was standing at the entrance, coffee cup in hand, her badge back on her lanyard where it belonged. She was, at that moment, simply a nurse in a hospital, in the building she'd been walked out of 22 hours ago. His face did something complicated when he looked at her. The performed authority was gone. Stripped out overnight by the sequence of events, by a maintenance basement and a folding chair and 14 months of careful maneuvering coming apart in a single afternoon. What was underneath it was harder to read, not just fear. Something more like the specific devastation of a person who had believed, at some level, that the architecture of what they'd built was solid and was now standing in the rubble of that belief. She did not say anything to him. There was nothing useful to say. He was walked through the lobby and out the doors and into a vehicle that was waiting at the curb. The lobby continued its morning. The front desk staff continued their work. A family came through the entrance with a child in a wagon and a balloon tied to the handle. The building went on. She spent the afternoon in the ICU. Vreeland had been moved off the nasal cannula to room air at noon, which meant his respiratory function had recovered enough that he no longer needed supplemental oxygen. Marsh had ordered a repeat chest X-ray, which confirmed the diaphragmatic motion was normalizing, and had written in the chart with the careful thoroughness of someone who was going to be very precise about this patient's recovery record. Vreeland was sitting up when she came in. Actually sitting up, the head of the bed raised to 45 degrees, eating a cup of yogurt with the focused attention of a man who had been NPO for days and was treating a cup of plain yogurt like a significant meal. "I heard Voss got walked out," he said. "You heard correctly." "Anybody filming it?" "Probably. There were 3 news vans in the parking lot." He made a sound of grim satisfaction. "What about the data sales?" "The external consultant." "Federal compliance team is tracing the LLC. It'll take time." She sat down. "There's also a whistleblower case developing separately. I can't tell you the details." "Marcus Webb," he said. She looked at him. "Barlow told me," he said. "This morning." He set the yogurt cup down. His brother was in the 3rd Battalion. Different company than mine, but I knew the name. Patrick Webb. He was a good soldier. He was quiet for a moment. He was 24. "I know." "How's the brother holding up?" "He's scared and exhausted and meeting with a federal attorney at noon." She paused. "He'll be okay. He did something legally complicated for the right reason with enough evidence to make it matter. That's a survivable position." Vreeland nodded slowly. "And you?" "I already answered that question." "That was last night. I'm asking again." She thought about it genuinely this time, rather than reflexively. "Tired," she said, "and relieved in a way that hasn't fully arrived yet. Still waiting for the next thing to go wrong. A professional hazard. Occupational conditioning, she said. When things stabilize fast, it usually means they're going to destabilize again. Or it means they actually stabilized. He looked at her with the directness she'd always found uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. Not everything is a before the next crisis. Some things are just done. I know. Do you? She looked at the monitors above his bed. Steady, good numbers. The kind of readout that said this patient was going to leave this hospital on his own feet. I'm working on it, she said. He nodded. He picked up the yogurt cup again. General Pruitt called me this morning, he said casually, between spoonfuls. He told me about the commendations, the whole history. He called me too, last night. He said there are going to be conversations about what comes next. He glanced at her. He asked if I thought you'd be open to them. What did you tell him? I told him I had no idea, and that he should ask you himself. He finished the yogurt and set the cup on the tray. But I also told him that what you did yesterday, the diagnosis, the whole thing, that wasn't rusty. You haven't lost any of it. Whatever you've been doing for 3 years, you haven't lost what matters. She didn't answer that. Nora, I heard you. I know, you're just deciding whether to argue with it. I'm not going to argue with it, she said. I'm going to think about it. That's an improvement, he said, and almost smiled. At 3 in the afternoon, Forsett knocked on the consultation room door and came in to where Nora was sitting with a cup of tea and the specific stillness of someone who had decided to not move for 20 minutes. The whistleblower attorney arrived, Forsett said. Marcus Webb has retained her and they've had their initial consultation. She sat down across from Nora. He's agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. His attorney has filed the formal whistleblower disclosure, which means the illegal access question is now part of a legal process rather than a liability. The emails will be reviewed under a federal evidentiary protocol. Will they be usable? With how the disclosure is structured, and given the public interest weight of a wrongful death inquiry connected to a federal contract. Forsett paused. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Helena has been briefed. They're opening a parallel criminal inquiry. The evidentiary standard for what Marcus obtained will be evaluated in that context. His attorney is good. I've worked with her before. And the external consultant? The Delaware LLC? We have a name. Forsett looked at her steadily. It traces to a former hospital systems executive who runs a medical consulting operation that contracts with several Mountain West healthcare facilities. This is not an isolated case, she paused. Patrick Webb may not be the only wrongful death connected to this pattern. The consultation room was very quiet. How many facilities? Nora asked. We're still mapping it, at least 4 others in the DoD contract network. Forsett's expression was controlled and grim. This is larger than Harlow Ridge. What happened here was one node in something that's been running for at least 3 years. Nora sat with that. My suspension, she said slowly. If I hadn't been suspended. If Voss hadn't panicked and moved against me, you would have kept building the case the slow way. Probably another 6 months, Forsett said. Maybe more. He broke it open himself. He was afraid of you, Forsett said. He looked at a nurse pulling a chart and saw the end of what he'd built. He was wrong about what you were looking at, but he wasn't wrong about you. Nora stared at the table. You should know, Forsett continued, that the compliance team found a second folder on Voss's drive. Not billing, not patient data, personnel. She paused. It contained files on 4 current employees that he'd been using as leverage, things he'd found or manufactured to ensure their cooperation. Who? The head of the billing department, 2 attending physicians, and, Forsett met her gaze, the hospital's compliance officer, the internal one, the person who was supposed to catch exactly this kind of irregularity. He had his own compliance officer, had leverage over her, yes. Her files contained documented evidence of a medication error from 2 years ago that she'd self-reported internally, but not escalated to the state board. Technically a reportable event. Voss had the documentation and she knew it. Nora thought about the 3 previous staff complaints that Forsett had mentioned last night, the 2 nurses who'd been terminated. The third, the one currently in her own administrative review. The 3rd nurse, she said, the one in the current review process. Her name is Rosalind Carr. She flagged a billing irregularity 6 weeks ago and was placed under administrative review 3 days later. Forsett paused. Her review is being halted effective today. She should know that. She's being contacted this afternoon. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then, Forsett, the compliance officer, the one with the medication error. What happens to her? That depends on the investigation and on what her level of actual complicity was versus coercion. Forsett looked at her evenly. You have a perspective on that? She was being coerced. What she did or didn't do under that coercion needs to be evaluated in that context. She paused. The medication error she self-reported 2 years ago, was anyone harmed? The internal report says no, caught before administration. Then what he held over her was real but minimal in its original weight. He made it heavier than it was. That matters when you're assessing culpability. Forsett looked at her for a long moment. You'd make a better investigator than you think. I'm a nurse, Nora said. You're several things, Forsett said, and stood. The hospital board wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. Grant specifically requested you be present before they finalize the interim leadership structure. She moved toward the door. I'd recommend going. I'll think about it. Forsett paused at the door. There's one more thing. The reporter outside, the one from the billing station. His editor got a tip this morning, anonymous, from a number that traces to a prepaid phone purchased in Crestfall 3 months ago. She looked at Nora. The tip included a summary of the billing irregularities and a reference to Patrick Webb's case by name. Nora looked at her steadily. Marcus must have set it in motion before last night. Must have, Forsett agreed. The story is going to run on the 6 o'clock news. It will name Voss. It will reference the federal investigation. It will mention a Harlow Ridge nurse who identified a critical diagnostic issue under adverse circumstances. She paused. It will not name you. The reporter honored that condition. What condition? The one that came with the tip. Anonymous source, anonymous nurse. His choice, apparently. She opened the door. Someone wanted the story out, and they wanted you protected while it went out. She left. Nora sat in the consultation room and thought about Marcus Webb, 26 years old, 7 months in this building, carrying everything he knew about his brother's death in a USB drive and a long, patient silence. She thought about the prepaid phone, the timing, the protected source condition. She thought about Patrick Webb's file, flagged for an external consultant's review, the 72-hour delay, the pulmonary embolism 40 hours in. Then her phone rang. It was Barlow. We have a problem, he said without any lead-in. The external consultant, the Delaware LLC, Forsett's team ran the full trace this afternoon. She told me. Did she tell you the name? She said a former hospital systems executive. His name is Dr. Warren Tillis. A pause. He was the chief medical officer at Harlow Ridge before Voss arrived. He left 14 months ago to set up his consulting practice. She went very still. He left the week Voss arrived, Barlow said. They weren't replacing each other, she said slowly. They were transitioning. The compliance team found a financial structure that connects the LLC's revenue directly to a personal account. Tillis built the system. Voss ran it on the ground. Another pause. Tillis was here for 3 years before Voss. The patient data sales, the billing manipulation, it started under Tillis. Voss inherited it and continued it, and Tillis has been receiving payments from the LLC every month since he left. She stared at the wall. Where is Tillis now? She said. That's the problem, Barlow said. Forsett's team went to notify him for questioning this afternoon. His practice address is a registered office in Billings. Empty. His home address is a house in the Billings Heights neighborhood. He stopped. Barlow. His neighbor says he left this morning with luggage. She thought he was going on a trip. His voice had flattened. His car was found at Billings Logan International at 2:30 this afternoon. He checked in for a flight. The flight departed at 3:15. Where was the flight going? It was a connecting itinerary. The first leg was domestic. He paused. The final destination was not. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Which country, she asked, The booking was through a third-party travel site using a secondary identity. Barlow's voice was very precise. But the destination on the itinerary was Sao Paulo. The consultation room was very small and very quiet. He knew, she said. He knew before we did that the investigation had broken through. Someone told him, Barlow said. Between last night and this morning, someone in the building tipped him off. She thought about the compliance officer, the two physicians, the head of billing, all of them with leverage held over their heads, all of them knowing their leverage holder was now in federal custody. Any one of them could have made a call. Interpol, she said. Forset's filing the request, but Sao Paulo it's complicated, and we don't have confirmation of final destination. The connecting itinerary could be a cover. She stood up. The personal account, she said. The one Tillis's payments went to. It's domestic? It was. As of this morning, it's showing a large transfer out. Barlow paused. $740,000. Initiated at 9:17 this morning. 9:17. An hour after the Billings Morning News ran the segment. An hour after the shape of the investigation became public. Without names, without enough detail to be specific, but enough. Enough for someone who knew what had been built and how it could fall. He's not going to Sao Paulo, she said. No? He's going to wherever the money went. Sao Paulo is the noise. She paused. Where does someone move $740,000 at 9 in the morning when they have 3 hours to disappear? Barlow was quiet for a moment. Then, Forset needs to hear this. I know. She was already moving toward the door. Tell her I'm coming up. She went into the hallway. The afternoon shift was changing. The corridor had the particular population of a hospital at 3:30. The day staff finishing, the evening staff beginning, patients being moved, medications being distributed, the constant specific work of keeping people alive continuing regardless of everything else. She was halfway to the elevator when she almost walked into Dr. Marsh. He was coming from the direction of the ICU, chart in hand, and he stopped when he saw her with the particular expression of a man who had something to say and had been looking for the moment to say it. Nurse Callahan, he said. Dr. Marsh. He held the chart in both hands. He looked at it briefly and then at her with the careful, considered quality of a person who was about to do something that didn't come naturally to them. The diaphragmatic splinting, he said. I've been a cardiologist for 19 years. I've managed thoracic trauma cases at 4 different institutions. He paused. I have never had that presentation catch my attention the way it should have. Not once. She waited. I don't know your background, he said. I don't need to know it. But whatever it is, he stopped. Tried again. That was extraordinary clinical work. I want you to know I said that. Thank you, she said, for acting on it when I brought it to you. Not everyone would have. He looked slightly caught by that. That's the job, he said. Yes, she agreed. It is. She went to the elevator. The doors closed. In the reflection of the polished metal doors, she could see herself, hospital badge on, stethoscope around her neck, looking exactly like what she was. A nurse in a hospital at the end of a very long day that was not yet over. The elevator went up. On the 4th floor, Forset was in the former director's office, Voss's office, the corner suite with the mountain view, with 2 of her team and a laptop open on the desk. And when Nora walked in, she looked up with the expression of someone who had been waiting for her specifically. Barlow called ahead, Forset said. Tillis isn't going to Sao Paulo. I know. I've been thinking the same thing. Forset turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a financial transaction record. The outgoing transfer from Tillis's account, the $740,000, the 917 timestamp. The receiving account is in the Cayman Islands, but it's a pass-through. The money moved again at 10:04. She pointed. To here. The second destination was a private banking institution in Luxembourg. That's not a run account, Nora said. That's a holding account. You move money to Luxembourg when you're planning to access it from somewhere in Europe. That's the working assumption. Forset looked at her. Which means he's not flying south. He's flying east. What connecting flights were available out of his domestic leg? Forset's team member, The younger man, the one who'd come in with her the night before, pulled up the itinerary display. His domestic leg went to Chicago O'Hare. From O'Hare, the Sao Paulo flight departed at 3:15, but there were 4 transatlantic departures between 2 and 5 p.m. Nora looked at the list. London, Frankfurt, Paris, Amsterdam. Amsterdam, she said. Forsett looked at her. Why Amsterdam? Luxembourg is 3 hours from Amsterdam by train, no border check between them. She paused. He doesn't need a direct flight to Luxembourg. He needs a landing point in the Schengen area. Forsett looked at her team member who was already typing. Then she looked back at Nora with the expression of someone recalibrating. He's already in the air, the team member said. The Amsterdam flight departed O'Hare at 4:02. The room was very still. Forsett picked up her phone. She made a call with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly which number to dial and what to say when it was answered. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. When she put the phone down, her expression was unreadable. International coordination, she said. We have a window. She looked at Nora. You didn't have to bring this to me, Forsett said. You could have gone home. Patrick Webb was 24, Nora said, and he wasn't the only one. Forsett held her gaze. Then she turned back to her team and the window started closing and the work began. And somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, at 37,000 feet, Doctor. Warren Tillis sat in a business class seat with a glass of water he wasn't drinking and watched the darkness outside the window and thought he had made it out in time. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. Dr. Warren Tillis was detained at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport at 6:42 in the morning, local time, by Dutch federal authorities acting on an Interpol provisional arrest notice filed 40 minutes after his flight departed O'Hare. He had walked off the jet bridge, through the terminal's long glass corridor with its early morning quiet and its gray northern light, and was 12 steps from the passport control queue when 2 officers appeared on either side of him and said his name. Not the name on his boarding pass, his actual name. He stopped. He didn't run. There was nowhere to run to, and he was 61 years old and had spent the last 14 hours telling himself he'd been careful enough, and the specific collapse of that belief in a Dutch airport corridor at dawn hit him the way those things hit. Not with drama, but with a sudden total weight that took the argument out of his legs. He sat down on a bench near the passport control windows and waited for what came next. Forsett's team had his phone records, his financial trail, and the email archive, legally entered into evidence under the federal whistleblower protocol that Marcus Webb's attorney had filed in Crestfall, Montana, 16 hours earlier. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Helena had filed the criminal complaint that morning. The provisional arrest notice had 22 charges attached to it, including wire fraud, illegal sale of protected health information, and 1 count of criminal negligence contributing to wrongful death. Patrick Webb's name was in that last charge. It was the one that would not negotiate down. What? Nora found out when Barlow called her at 1 in the afternoon, Montana time. She was at the hospital. She'd gone in that morning because Vreeland was being evaluated for discharge and because the board meeting with Sylvia Grant was at 10 and because she didn't know how to be at home while things were still in motion. Schiphol detained him, Barlow said. 6:42 a.m. their time. He's in Dutch federal custody pending extradition proceedings. She was standing in the corridor outside the ICU. She put her back against the wall. How long does extradition take? She asked. Months, usually, but the charge list is significant and the treaty is solid. He's not walking away from this. A pause. His Luxembourg account has been frozen. Dutch authorities moved on it within an hour of the detention.
Yikes.
$740,000, sitting in a frozen account in Europe, attached to 22 criminal charges and the name of a 24-year-old soldier who had come home from his second deployment and died in a hospital bed waiting for a surgery that had been delayed so someone could make money on a billing code. Thank you, she said. Forsett wanted you to know, Barlow said. She said, he paused. She said you were right about Amsterdam. She looked at the floor for a moment. She would have gotten there. Maybe. But you got there faster. He paused again, differently this time. The board meeting this morning. How did that go? Grant offered me a position, she said. nursing practice coordinator with a secondary advisory role on the DoD contract compliance review. Are you going to take it? She thought about the question the way she'd been thinking about it since Grant had said it across the boardroom table that morning. Carefully, honestly, without rushing toward either the comfortable answer or the dramatic one. Part of it, she said. The compliance advisory role? Yes. The coordinator position. I'm going back to the floor first. I need to be on the floor before I manage anything. I need to remember what the work is before I'm responsible for how other people do it. Barlow was quiet. That's not modesty, she said. That's just how I think it should work. I know, he said. That's why I didn't argue. Vreeland was discharged at 2:30. He walked out of the ICU on his own, which he'd been determined to do since that morning, and which Marsh had permitted with the resigned acceptance of a physician who had learned, over 2 days, that this particular patient's determination was a clinical factor you incorporated rather than fought. He was slow, and he used the wall twice in the corridor, and he was noticeably short of breath by the time they reached the elevator, but he was walking. 2 of his men were waiting in the lobby, the ones who'd flown in on their own time, the ones who'd been in the waiting area on 3 when everything broke open. They were both in civilian clothes, and when Vreeland came through the lobby doors, they stood up with the specific, contained quality of people who were relieved in a way they weren't going to make a production of. Nora walked him to the lobby and stopped there. He turned. "You're not coming to the car," he said. "You have people," she said. "You don't need me to walk you to a car." He looked at her for a moment. His color was better than it had been at any point in the last 2 days. The medication adjusted and the respiratory mechanics stabilizing and his body doing what bodies did when you gave them the right conditions. Imperfectly, slowly, but stubbornly. "The conversations Pruitt mentioned," he said. "About what comes next." "I know." "Will you have them? Actually have them, not just say you will, and then—" "Yes," she said, "I'll have them." He held her gaze, then he nodded once, the kind of nod that was less acknowledgement and more settling. A thing put down in the right place. "You saved my life," he said, "twice. The math on that is going to bother me for a while. Don't let it. I was doing my job. Both times?" She thought about a forward position in Cordovan province, the specific weight of improvised materials and the noise, and the way time moved in those situations. Not faster or slower, just differently, with a different kind of clarity. "Both times," she said. "It was just a different job the first time." He almost smiled. His ribs stopped him getting all the way there. He walked out through the automatic doors with his men. One of them held the exterior door. The cold came in briefly, sharp and clean. Marcus Webb gave his full testimony to the federal investigation team on the same afternoon. His attorney sat beside him for 4 hours in the consultation room on 3, and the email archive, all 14 months of it, was entered into the evidentiary record under the whistleblower protocol. The illegal access question was formally addressed in the disclosure filing, the public interest weight applied, and the U.S. Attorney's Office indicated, through Marcus's attorney, that prosecution of the access method was not a priority given the nature of what the access had revealed. It wasn't a clean outcome. It wasn't supposed to be. There were months of proceedings ahead, and Marcus Webb's name would be attached to a federal case that would take longer than he wanted to resolve, and none of that would bring Patrick back or make the 7 months he'd spent in this building feel like anything other than what it had been. Grief wearing the clothing of purpose. But the testimony was in the record. Patrick's case was in the record. The names of the other patients whose treatment had been manipulated were in the record. That mattered. It didn't fix anything. It mattered anyway. Nora sat with Marcus for 20 minutes after his attorney left, in the same consultation room where she'd first briefed Forsett 2 days ago. He was exhausted in the specific way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down. And the setting down was relief, but it was also disorientation. The body not quite knowing what to do without the weight it had organized itself around. "What do you do now?" she asked him. He thought about it. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's the first time in 7 months I've been able to say that." "That's not nothing," she said. "No." He looked at his hands. Patrick would have had an opinion about all of this. He always had opinions. What would he have said? Marcus was quiet for a moment. He would have said I took the long way around. A pause. And then he would have said it was worth it. She didn't tell him that would be enough, because she didn't know if it would be, and that kind of reassurance wasn't something she had to give. What she knew was that he'd done a hard thing for a true reason in the only way available to him, and that the record now reflected what had actually happened to his brother, and that was real and permanent in a way that couldn't be revised by anyone. That had to be enough, not because it was just, but because it was what existed. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in December, Nora Callahan walked back onto the post-surgical floor at Harlow Ridge Medical Center for her first shift since the suspension. Daphne was already there. So was Rosaline Carr, reinstated the week before, who looked at Nora with the expression of someone who had been on the wrong side of the same machinery and understood exactly what the last 3 weeks had cost. They didn't make a thing of it. That wasn't the floor's culture, and it wasn't Nora's. There was a patient in bed 7 with a new presentation, and a physician who was unreachable, and a morning that needed managing. She picked up the chart. She read it the way she always read them, carefully, thoroughly, with the particular attention of someone who had learned, in conditions most people never encountered, that the details other people skipped were often the ones that mattered. She found what she was looking for in the medication record, flagged it, documented her reasoning, initiated the escalation protocol, the correct one, the one that was actually in effect on this floor. By noon, the patient was stable and trending in the right direction. By noon, Nora was already on the next chart. That was the thing nobody outside the work ever fully understood. Not the generals who called to discuss commendations, not the federal agents who ran the investigations, not even the patients who recovered and went home and remembered the person who'd helped them only as a kind face and careful hands. The work was not a single moment of competence under pressure. It was not the dramatic intervention or the correct diagnosis or the thing that got written in someone's service record. It was the chart, and the next chart, and the one after that. It was showing up in a building that had tried to remove you and doing the job anyway, not because you'd proved something, but because the patients in those beds needed someone who would actually look at them. She had never needed anyone to understand that. She had needed occasionally to be allowed to do it. That was all she had ever needed. And now, finally, unambiguously, irrevocably, she was.